Hello, today we are going to discuss the brief history of the creation of Israel. I will brief you how Israel came to being, who were behind the creation of this country, and what will be the consequences next. And today we will discuss back from 1870 about the Zionism to the conflicts of 2021 between Israel and Palestine, about the atrocities caused by Israeli troops. We also will discuss about the United Nations partition plan, alias, where it refers to Jewish return from diaspora, peace treaties between Israel, Palestinian, and other countries, especially Arab countries, and the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Stay with us and you will know the reality behind the creation of Israel and the conflicts in today's Palestine. At the end of this video, you will have a clear idea that whether Palestine existed before or Israel. You will have a clear idea that how the creation of Israel has started and who played an important role in the creation of this country. Jews living around the world began feeling that no country accepts them as their own. So if they want to live peacefully, they need to create their own country, a country which is purely Jewish. There was an Austro-Hungarian journalist. His name was Theodor Herzl. He started a new political movement in his 1896 pamphlet, which is called Zionism. He said that the Jews should get their separate country, and this was not a new idea. Since 1870s, there were several organizations calling themselves a lover of Zion, and they were already propagating the idea. Because of this reason, the first large scale of migration of Jews was seen in the Palestine area. They built many permanent settlements in the area and started living there. But the question arises here that why they choose the Palestine area? Because this was very holy area for them. Jerusalem is the holiest place for the Jews, for the Muslims, and for the Christians also. We have to remember that at that time there was no Israel, Gaza, or the West Bank, so the whole area was called Palestine. And it was under the Ottoman Empire, and back in those days the Christians, the Muslims, and Jews lived together very peacefully. There wasn't that much conflict as we see it today. Let's think about 1915, where the World War I was going. At that time the British and French and Arab revolutionaries were fighting the Ottoman Empire. So the British played a clever hand there. They told Arab revolutionaries that in return for their support and defeating the Ottoman Empire, they will give them the Palestine area. And the Arab revolutionaries were fighting to create a unified Arab country. They wanted an Arab country from Syria to Yemen, which is called Unified Arab State. The Britishers promised the same thing to the Jews, which is called the Balfour Declaration. They said that they will help them to create their own Jewish country near Palestine. Why they did this, there was many reasons behind that. One of the reasons was to gain influence on the American politics. But in reality, the British made a secret deal with the French, which is called Sykes-Picot Agreement. As soon as the Ottoman Empire fell after the World War I, and later they will divide this area between themselves. So British took over the control of the Palestine region. And from 1918 to 1948, the entire Palestine area was under the control of the British government. At this time in Germany, Hitler gets to the political power, and the Jewish or the massacre in millions and genocide. The Jews flee from Hitler-controlled Europe to the different countries to save themselves. Some got refuge in America, but many of these Jews went to Palestine. So British allowed them to enter Palestine initially, but later they start stopping them from coming to Palestine. Because of this, an Israeli nationalist movement started in Palestine. So at the same time, around the 1940s, Palestine nationalist movement has also begun, and they were also demanding their own country. In 1948, when the conflict surged between the Jewish and Muslims, so the British thought that it is enough for them and they cannot stay there for longer time. So they left the Jews to form a Jewish country and the Palestinians to form their own country. So they accepted that they could not do anything to help these two communities, and they ceded this responsibility to the United Nations, and the British then left Palestine. So it was in 1947 that the United Nations partition plan released. In the plan, the United Nations kept 55% of the area for the Jewish, and the rest, 45% of the area, under the Arab Palestinian country. And at the same time, the Jerusalem, which is the holy and very historically very important for the three religions, Jewish, Christians, and Muslim. It remained under the international control in the United Nations partition plan. The Jewish accepted this plan, and so it was in 1948 where the Israel came in between. So, but the other neighboring Arab countries were not pleased with this plan at all. They believed that the plan was basically the Britishers' way of continuing their colonialism. So they started a war against Israel. So they were saying that they will not allow the Jews to take any part of the land. So this was the first Arab-Israel war of the 1948, which was a very historic war in the Middle East. So more than 5 countries were fighting against Israel, a newly born country in the Middle East. So the Jews living in Israel knew that 5 years ago or some years back, they had seen how the rest of the world treated them, like how Hitler and how they were being treated in Russia and other countries in the world. And now all the Arab countries were starting a war against them. So Jewish were thinking that if they do not fight to survive, then they wouldn't be able to survive ever. So to save themselves, they have fought with all they have in their hands. And Israel later won the war against the 5 Arab countries around him, and then they defeated all the countries. After the war ended in 1949, the areas that were supposed to be Palestinians according to the United Nations partition plan, Israel occupied several of these areas, including West Jerusalem. So the Gaza Strip area went to the Egypt, and the West Bank area went to Jordan. This meant that the Palestinians did not have any country any longer. More than 700,000 Palestinians had to leave their homes and become refugees in Arab countries. And this is called 1948 Palestinian Exodus. So later in 1967, the second Arab-Israel war broke out, and this war lasted for 6 days, and Israel won this too. And this war, not only Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank area, but also the large Egyptian peninsula was occupied by Israel. So Palestinians wanted their own country. For this reason, it was in 1964 when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded. Initially, their aim was through armed struggle to fight with weapons and use any kind of force to win their country back. And in the beginning, they also wanted that Israel should cease to exist. There should not be any country called Israel in the map of the world. Because of this, the USA and Israel declared it to be a terrorist organization. So meanwhile, in 1973, the third Arab-Israel war began. And this war did not change things much. In 1947, the PLO got officially recognized by the United Nations General Assembly to be the representative of the Palestinians. In 1979, the peace talks between Egypt and Israel started and was successful. And Egypt became the first Arab country to recognize Israel as a country that can exist. So after the peace talks, the entire Egyptian peninsula area captured by Israel was returned to Egypt by Israel. So Egyptian and Israeli prime ministers both were awarded Nobel Prize for the successful peace treaty between these two countries. 2 years later of the treaty, the right-wing extremists on 6 October 1981 assassinated their prime minister in Cairo. It was related to the treaty that he has signed with Israel. So from 1967 to 1980s, it had been more than 10 years since that Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And during this period, many Israelis started establishing their colonies in the West Bank, and they started building settlements and living there permanently. And Israeli government both directly and indirectly supported them. And it says that more than 250 Israeli settlements and outposts have been established across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And contravention of international law, over 620,000 Israeli settlers live in the occupied Palestinian territory. So now the Israelis claim that the entire West Bank area is theirs, and that's why they all reside there. So Israeli settlements started cropping up the West Bank area, and the international community deems these settlements to be illegal because these settlements goes against the United Nations partition plan, and Palestinians sees this as the colonization. In 1992, Israel Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin says that PLO is not a terrorist organization, so they just want their country and the Israelis should let them have it. So Israel officially recognized PLO, and in return, PLO officially recognized Israel as a country. So late in 1993, there was an accord between these two countries, which is called Oslo Accord. And for the first time, both sides came together and talked about how the country can be correctly and peacefully divided and how the Palestinian country be created. As a result, in 1994, the Palestinian government established for the first time, which named as Palestinian National Authority. But at this point in time, Israelis had already established permanent settlements in many West Bank areas, which were supported by the Israeli government, and the Palestinians were living in few areas, and was then decided to divide the West Bank area into three parts. It was Area A, Area B, and Area C. They agreed to the Area A would be where the Palestinian government would control. Area B, both the governments, Israel and Palestinians, would exercise their control, and Area C will be the areas where the Israeli government retain control. But Palestinians in 1994 got some pieces of land in the West Bank area and Gaza Strip, which was contrary to the United Nations partition plan to form their country. In the same year, in 1994, the president of Palestine Authority, Yasser Arafat, and Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin were awarded Nobel Prize. Later, the whole situation gone worse when the extreme right-wing Jewish people assassinated their prime minister. A Jewish extremist shot the Israeli prime minister thrice from a pistol at the point-blank range in 1995. It was because of his compromise with the Palestinians. And they did not want to give a single piece of land to Palestinians and wanted the entire Palestine to be Israel's. So some 5 years later, before this, in 1998, an Islamic group, people came together and formed a group called Hamas. Hamas claims that the PLO is being too secular and they compromise a lot with Israel. In reality, they want to erase Israel from the map. When the peace treaty signed in 1994 between the Palestine and Israel, the Jews started hating their prime minister, and on the other hand, Hamas started hating PLO. This was leading to surges in conflicts. So in 1996, there was elections in Palestine, which was boycotted by Hamas, and they exploded some bombs in Israel, and that led to the increase of the extremism in both sides on the right-wing level, and both sides started hating each other. And 2002, violent protests were erupted in both sides. More than 100 Israelis and Palestinians died on the both sides. So there were clashes on the ground, and the people have become so skeptical of each other, and in a result, Israel started building walls around its settlements and deployed security guards and checkpoints, and it was difficult for Palestinians to live there. So in 2006, Hamas group runs the Palestinian elections and won. So it defeated the PLO party of Fatah by winning 74 out of 132 seats. So later in 2006, a civil war broke out between these two parties inside Palestine, and the supporters of one party started fighting the supporter of others, and this battle was named as the Battle of Gaza, and Palestine divided into two parts. In Gaza Strip, Hamas established its control, and the West Bank area went under the Fatah's PLO control. So the Israeli has continued not only to colonize the West Bank area, but the whole Palestinian territory for several decades, and this resulted to the recent clashes in Palestine. In 1993, Israel and Palestine were very close to drafting a peaceful solution, but what happened after that, the situation worsened to the extent that today there is a war between them. So with all these conflicts and all, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. And with no delay, U.S. President Harry Truman recognized the new nation on the same day. Although the United States supported the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which favored the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, President Franklin D. Roosevelt has assured that the United States would not intervene without consulting both the Jews and the Arab in the region. The British, who held the colonial mandate for Palestine and until May 1948, opposed both the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine, and as well as unlimited immigration of Jewish refugees to the region. So Britain wanted to preserve good relations with the Arabs to protect the vital political and economic interests in Palestine. A Jewish national movement, Zionism, emerged in the late 19th century, partially in response to the growing anti-Semitism, a part of which Aliyah, which is Jewish return from diaspora, increased. So during the World War I, the British government publicly committed to create a Jewish national home and was granted a mandate to rule Palestine by the League of Nations for this purpose. Rival Arab nationalism also claimed rights over the former Ottoman territories and sought to prevent Jewish migration into Palestine, leading to growing Arab-Jewish tensions. Israeli independence in 1948 was accompanied by an exodus of Arabs from Israel. The Arab-Israeli conflict and the subsequent Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries to Israel. Right now, about 43% of the world's Jews live in Israel today, the largest Jewish community in the world. So this was all about Israel and Palestine. I'm sure right now that you know how this country came into being, into existence, and now you can judge how these people came and occupied the Palestinian land and home. And now they claim that Palestine is all theirs, and the people outside the world as well support them.